ANNO 1602 was released in 1996 and started a city building and strategy series that survives to this day. So ANNO 1602, Creation of the New World as it was known in Europe, or 1602 AD in North America, is a real-time strategy city building game developed in Austria, in which you play as an unnamed European country with the general goal to explore the various islands on any given map, settle them, and start developing settlements. There are various challenges you have to contend with, from the increasing needs for more diverse and exotic products from your inhabitants to creating trading relationships with the other countries or native settlements on the map, dealing with pirates, as well as the odd natural disaster. So first things first, the tutorial is very quick and focused. Maybe because this is the first game in the series and as such there's less features to deal with. But it takes you through the basics of setting up a settlement and understanding production chains, trading, and combat real quickly. This can and should be supplemented by looking through the manual. This was still the 90s, so reading manuals remained an important source of information about games. At first sight, the graphics might not look super appealing to our 2020s eyeballs, when we have become accustomed to realistic 3D graphics, stylized voxel graphics, pixel art, and everything in between at the same time. And all of these visual options look really great nowadays because of the absolutely insane amounts of processing power we have at our disposal. 23 years ago, it was different. If you're thinking of 1998, then you might be remembering the release of important 3D titles such as Unreal, Delta Force, and Half-Life. And you'd be very right. 3D games were blossoming into the rough equivalent age of the preteens back then. However, the same 1998 was also the year of titles such as StarCraft Commandos and Red Alert Retaliation. So when we take those latter examples into mind, ANNO 1602 doesn't look out of place, especially when you consider it was made in Austria by an indie studio pretty much. All of that being said, the graphics kinda grow on you the more you play, and the more time you spend zoomed in. They're not as detailed as they would become in its immediate sequel, ANNO 1503, but there is something endearing in their simplicity and in how much they manage to convey. And maybe simplicity isn't the correct word, because it's not like they're minimalistic or anything. In fact, I really appreciate how there are several designs for the initial basic houses that you build. This is a feature that doesn't exist even in many current day city builders, so having this game from 1998 offer this sort of visual diversity is not just surprising but astounding, seeing as how none of the Impressions games at the time did that. And the house evolutions are also very different and interesting as well, birthing settlements that don't look as monolithic as they would get to look like in later installments. Something that has become such a part of daily gaming life that we don't even think twice about it is the mouse scroll wheel and its uses, whether we use it to scroll through menus or to zoom in and out of maps. Nowadays, it's the most basic bitch of features, and it is one thing that is completely missing from ANNO 1602. And even though I was half expecting it, it takes some time to get used to the lack of such a common sense feature nowadays. Zooming in and out, as well as the game speeds, are hotkeyed to the F number keys. F2, 3 and 4 will progressively zoom you in, while F5, 6 and 7 stand for normal, double and quadruple speed. This goes a long way to making the game still fairly playable nowadays. It takes a bit to get used to, but you get there quite fast. Music and sound effects are good, but the effects in particular can get a bit repetitive, and there's always a gigantic difference in sound volume whenever you get a video playing. Whenever important events take place, such as discovering an ore or gold vein, or when you're attacked by pirates and such, a video will play and it will be super noisy.
You have failed.
I don't know if that's a thing because of the GOG version, or it's just on my machine or what, but it is annoying. What is the one thing I always make a point of mentioning in any and all city building videos I make? The road system. And I gotta say, roads are not as crucial in ANNO 1602 as they will become in the upcoming sequels, especially when it comes to houses. But let me talk about the visuals first. because I love this. The initial dirt road you can build is illustrated as a couple of parallel wheel tracks, which is what you'd normally see in truly rural areas where civilization hasn't completely gotten to yet and people still use horse-drawn carts for their daily lives. But they've been outfitting them with car tires for a while now. This is very much a daily occurrence in many Romanian villages and towns and cities. So now for the mechanics. As I said earlier, Anno 1602 is less road focused because it does not require your houses to have road access in order for them to be inhabited and evolve. The game still suggests they be made accessible by road so that the fire brigade can get to a fire, but other than that, Anno 1602 is where you can actually build homes willy-nilly, similar to what might have happened in the actual 1602. The fire threat I'm talking about is pretty real though, and you can get in some difficult situations if you build densely packed houses and one of them catches fire like I did, and then this happens. Otherwise, island exploration is super simple and straightforward. All you have to do is reach the island with your ship, click a button and wait a little bit. Setting up automatic trade is similarly a pretty simple endeavor. However, on the maps where free traders exist, the money-making potential from automated trade routes is limited due to the amount of demand constantly varying because of the aforementioned free traders. On the maps where pirates exist, things can get dicey if you're not super careful and lose your initial ship early in the game. I learned that ye olde the hard way, but then I realized that being completely zoomed out with F2 will allow you to quite easily avoid pirate or enemy ships when, for instance, you have only one trading vessel and would like to maintain it in working order. The available campaigns range in what they'll have you do. The introductory ones are the simplest and easiest to engage with, but most of them have a fair bit of challenge in them. The game isn't difficult, but you can build yourself into some potentially not unwinnable situations, but situations in which you'd have to wait a long time to repair whatever you fucked up. So what you need to know in order to avoid this is that you need 120 settlers so that you can then build an iron ore mine and then make your own tools. The game also features combat. And in case you're new here and this is the first Anno video of mine that you see, you may not be aware of my feelings about combat in city building games. Not a fan. I know this series has always been a strategy/simulation type thing from the beginning, obviously. So in that context, it makes sense for it to have combat, but I play it for the city building aspect and that's just how I roll. Thankfully, you can pretty much avoid combat in the continuous play campaign, which is where I spent most of my time with the game. If, however, you want a more custom experience, while the game doesn't have a custom game feature, it does come with the map/campaign editor, which is really simple to use and allows you to set up a custom map fairly quickly. Anno 1503 is the second title in the Anno city building series. It was made 3 years before Anno 1701 in 2003, and as such, it for some reason still features some top-notch pixel art. I mean, this stuff is beautiful to look at. It makes me think I'm playing a Knights and Merchants sequel we never got. The style is so detailed and realistic that it makes it especially interesting to zoom in and out. I don't know if you could do this in the original game or if it's something implemented in the GOG version, but it's hella nice. I love zoom features in pixel art games. But there is a bit of a pitfall that comes with this realistic and detailed take, in that it makes everything look very samey and homogeneous. Once your houses start evolving into using bricks for their walls, most of the other service buildings will start to blend into the overall city layout. Idea being that you need to know which buildings cover which areas, and this will mean that you'll have to click a lot around to find the particular type of building that you're looking for. Or you play the game for so long that you start to automatically recognize them. Road networks are a crucial part of all city building games, and most of your buildings normally need road access in order to function. In Anno 1503, each building has several access points to which you can connect roads on several, if not all, sides of the building. Most of them are 3x3 squares and the road access spots are the middle square. This sounds like it's a great idea and offers a certain amount of flexibility in your city layout planning, but I found it to be confusing and really hard to get used to. This is obviously due to most other city builders not being so specific about road access. It's either one access point or it doesn't matter where the roads connect as long as they touch one side of the building. You can move the camera and see where the road access points are on the opposite sides, which you might need to do, but that is generally super confusing and I never do it with any sort of pleasure. It's a cool feature, don't get me wrong, because you get to see the gorgeous pixel art in all its entirety, and you will need it especially to properly place roads and quarries on different sides of mountains, but it's always mind-bending in a bad way. So everything about the UI, the buttons, the number and style of icons, everything about the UI is very extra. They went with a somewhat realistic design approach. I mean, the exit button is a door. This means they have to be rather large because of the limited resolutions possible back in 2003. The gist is, the user interface is clunky and overly complicated. Overall, the graphics have very pleasantly surprised me. The sprite animations as well. The wild animals roaming are pretty cool. They do not attack your people like they do in Stronghold or Caesar 3 for that matter, but on the other hand, the sheep are loud as hell. I mean, just check this out. Insane. Thankfully, you can turn the volume down on sound effects. The warehouses on any given island still communicate with each other through a form of possibly ancient ancestor inherited teleportation technology without needing to be connected by roads, but that's pretty much a trademark of the series by now. I am actually curious if they carried it to their Anno 1800 title. I like that you need to use an actual scout unit with a donkey in tow, no less, to discover what kind of minerals you can mine from the variety of mountain ranges. Similarly, you need to colonize other islands in order to grow all the resources you need to improve the level of your people, and there is still combat in the game. A lot of it by the looks of the many things you can build, but as per usual, I do not play city builders for combat and I avoid that type of content. If I want to get into fights and still do some amount of building, I'll play something like Aggressor's Ancient Rome, Warhammer 40k Gladius, or Old World. But that's just me, your mileage may vary. Now, onto the things I normally don't talk about in these reviews, but this is a case where I feel I have to, because the issues I had with running it on Windows 10, I believe influenced my decision of dropping the game earlier than I think I would have normally otherwise. Running GOG versions of older games is usually fine with Windows 10, haven't really had that many issues in general, but Anno 1503 has been something special. Even after getting it to run, which was a bit of a pain, I could not alt-tab out of it to do other things, which I understand might not be a big problem for most people out there, but I tend to listen to podcasts or watch videos while I play, and I do have to click away from the game from time to time. But whenever I would do that in Anno 1503, I'd return to lording over the spectral forms of my population, which would kinda be a cool idea for a city builder, but Afterlife already did it. On a lighter note, let me point out a funny translation mishap present in the GOG version of the game. For a little bit of background, the ANNO series were first created in Germany, just like some other somewhat similar titles like The Settlers or Patrician, which reminds me yet again that I maybe should play Patrician 3 soon. Also, quick tangent, goddamn, the Germans made a lot of resource management / strategy games because Settlers of Catan is also a German game. I just guess there was a lot of knowledge in the German zeitgeist about supply and logistics chains.
Are we the baddies?
Oh. Anyway, they have a very strong presence in all types of gaming media. Also unrelated, but the Dark Eye tabletop game isn't bad either. That's what Drakensang is based on. Anyway, back to my initial point. So, it makes sense for the games to have initially been in German, because the German-speaking market was large enough to support these types of endeavors, and then later translated. Which is what obviously happened to Anno 1503, because when you dig into the game's library feature, which thankfully the game has, you will find parts of it in German. My guess is that these were actually images as opposed to text, and they just forgot to replace them with English language ones. Don't worry, it's just tech tree stuff that are in German, but they are nicely illustrated with the things they refer to, so you won't have any issues understanding what's what. It's really not a big deal, but it is fun and funny thing to find in a 17-year-old game. Kinda like some sort of video game archaeology if you would. I found it very hard to get into Anno 1503, partly because of the lack of a nicely structured tutorial, the really cluttered and super busy interface, and the issues with running it on Windows 10. So I wouldn't jump into the Anno series with this one. Go with Anno 1701, or even better, Anno 1404. Anno 1701, the Sunken Dragon, does its theme very well. If you watched my Banished review, I mentioned that one of the game's major flaws, at least in my opinion, was the lack of a theme, and that's very important for me when playing a city builder title. Of course, really cool and interesting gameplay mechanics will win the day, but having them wrapped up in a nice theme makes the game that much more enjoyable in my book. And Anno 1701 definitely knows how to do its 18th century aesthetic theme right. It's not going for a truly realistic approach, instead choosing a stylized aesthetic, making use of bright colors and very expressive animations when it comes to the talking heads that you'll be seeing and hearing throughout the game. There are various levels of development that your settlement will have to go through in order to grow. Each of these levels is represented by different looking houses. The higher level your population is, the taller and prettier the house buildings get, and also the overall level of development is illustrated in the sumptuousness of your town square. The square will also be the first place that you see the effects of your citizens' morale, but more on those mechanics a bit later. The sound and music are quite solid as well. They do a great job at supporting the atmosphere of island colonies. The talking heads tend to get a bit repetitive during a custom game, but that's not that big of a problem, I think. While both the graphics and the sounds of the game are quite great, they're not the thing that stands out. Not even the mechanics. They are pretty good city builder mechanics, don't get me wrong. What really stands out though is the campaign. The game's campaign is something truly special. First of all, the game has one to begin with, which is something that hasn't really been that big of a thing in recent years, which on one hand is somewhat understandable, considering that most, if not all, new city builder games are indie productions and they tend to focus on enhancing the city building and managing mechanics and less so on any sort of narrative. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that we should get used to campaigns completely lacking from all city builder games going forward. Secondly, even when compared with past city builders, the campaign missions don't take the traditional route of you having to reach a certain number of population, level of civilization, surviving for a period of time, or reach a certain point on the map. Instead, Anno 1701's Sunken Dragon campaign starts up with you having to do all sorts of non-standard things, such as producing whale oil in order to supply an altar to a local fire god so that the storms on the sea subside. You need the storms to subside so you can then use the diving bell built by an inventor you had to hire with alcohol to explore several spots looking for the Eye of the Dragon artifact. That's just a very quick description of the very first mission in the campaign, and trust me, it has a bunch more where that came from. Then there's another super interesting mission in which you are given quite a large settlement early on and you're tasked with fixing its production and supply problems by demolishing certain buildings and replacing them with more appropriate ones, work which you have to do in order to reach the mission goal. But the campaign of Anno 1701, the Sunken Dragon, should be studied by current developers, be mined for what it does well, and implement those conclusions into their future city builder titles, because very rarely have I really cared about a city builder's campaign as much as I did for this one, because I was constantly interested in what the next mission had to offer. A big part of the game is managing your income and expenditures, because there will be several times during the game when you'll have to work with a deficit. The way to balance this out is to not really expand unless you need it and to shut down production buildings once you've reached either your maximum storage or a high enough number of whatever it is they're producing. Usually once you reach a storage maximum, the normal gaming reflex would be to increase that max, and while that makes sense in certain cases, in some of them it doesn't, because it only means that you'll continue to function at a deficit even though you aren't really using up the resources that you are producing to begin with. So that's a good moment to step down production or shut it down altogether, at least for a while. Obviously, this isn't a valid strategy if you can sell your excess resources, in which case you wouldn't be at a deficit to begin with, but that will depend on the map and/or mission. The game does do some interesting things in terms of how it deals with resource gathering. The first interesting thing to note is that all the warehouses on each island will access a shared pool of resources. So if you have a warehouse on one side of the island that's in charge of gathering food, for instance, A warehouse on the opposite side of the island will have access to the same amount of food, since every resource collected on any one island is pooled together and all warehouses have access to this common pool. One cool little thing relating to how some resources work is that some raw materials don't actually have to be sent to the warehouse in order for them to be further processed into usable resources. In order to use the raw materials, you'll need a different building which will fetch the raw materials automatically and only send the finished product to the warehouse. It's a nice little touch when it comes to the usual city builder logistics chain. Warehouses can only house a limited number of each resource, but building more warehouses will increase that cap. Also, upgrading the warehouses will do the same thing once the upgrade is available, but will also increase the number of carts that your warehouse can send to get resources. You can have many resource producing buildings linked to a warehouse via roads, but if that warehouse has only one cart, your resources might stockpile in the producing building, which is something you want to avoid because that stops them from making stuff. So I mentioned usable resources earlier, by which I mean usable by your population. See, in order for your population to develop, they'll need a steady supply of a variety of resources. Each level of population has new resource requirements which have to be supplied in order for them to be happy and hence allow you to advance to the next level of development. While you might become laser focused on upgrading your population level, there's something that you need to keep in mind. Once your population gets upgraded, they'll have new resource requirements in order to upgrade further. But keep in mind that you'll need to constantly increase your population as well. This means that you'll have to also constantly keep an eye on the resources that your population has been using until that moment, because production of those will have to increase as well in order to keep up with your population growth. I just said population a whole lot of times. Your people's happiness is crucial to them improving your settlement's level. In order for this to happen, their resource requirements have to be met 100%, their taxing level has to be in the bright green, and their houses have to be fully populated. The last part happens once the first two requirements are met. Taxation is a thing that you will need to keep an eye on and constantly fiddle with. There will be times where you should keep it as high as possible because you need the money, but make sure it never gets into the red because that's when the people riot and start burning things. Also, in order for your population to advance, the taxation has to be in the bright green section of the taxation bar, but even that has a maximum and a minimum, so keep them on a short leash is what I'm saying, taxation wise. And the situations do progress in the sense that you need to constantly increase your population, which means they will need more support buildings and more resources in order for them to not burn down your shit. Or better yet, burn down their shit. I don't know, that's weird how that works. Anyway, so roads are crucial to developing your settlement, but you can never have all the resources you need on any one island, regardless how large the island is. The largest islands will have only 3 slots for resources that can be produced on it, and these resources are randomly generated, so you'll need to expand to other islands which do have the things that you're lacking initially. Thankfully, the game takes place on maps populated with islands, and as such, ships play a pretty large role in the health, defense, and overall development of your settlement. So one of the extra layers of strategy that the game has is the fact that you will not only have to expand on other islands in order to gain access to new resources, but that you'll also need to build ships and then set up shipping routes so that they can move the resources around to where they're needed. While the number of shipping routes you can have is limited, you can daisy chain several stops on each of them, so you could have a ship visiting one or more destinations to pick up resources and then have them brought back to where you can process them. This approach won't be the most time efficient though, so direct shipping routes make the most sense. However, building the ships is expensive and then maintaining them also tends to add up, so it's as usual a balancing act that has to happen depending on the circumstances of each map. You can build a variety of ships, some of them exclusively for moving resources around, some of them for exploration, and some of them for war. The latter two being the ones outfitted with a varying number of cannons. The game does indeed also feature a bit of naval combat, because you won't be the only one on the map looking to build a thriving settlement, you'll have some competition, and sometimes this competition can get hostile. Combat in general isn't a large part of the game, and as such there isn't a lot of strategy or tactics to it. It mostly amounts to whoever has more or better ships wins. There is also a bit of ground combat, but again nothing detailed, just some terrestrial units which you can land on hostile islands to destroy the enemy's production facilities. That is if they don't have their own units to repel your invaders. Whoever has more or better equipped troops will usually win. The game unfortunately has no active pause, nor a very slow speed setting. Kind of a bit of a bitch, because you can and will definitely place buildings where you didn't want them, and you'll have to then demolish them and hence waste a bunch of resources, so take your time when building your settlement. I'm guessing active pause in city builders became a thing much later in their development, because nowadays it's something of a prerequisite sort of feature. Thankfully there is a turbo speed option, so you're either on normal or turbo, and this helps shorten the amount of real world time you spend in the game. And apropos of this, Anno is the first game, at least the first one I played, that lets you know how long you've been playing at each hour interval. It's a nice little touch that I enjoyed because city builders especially are notorious for being motherfucking time vampires, and at least this one tells you how long it's been sucking out your time. I approve. Anno 1701 The Sunken Dragon is a pretty solid city building experience which adds the extra layer of setting up shipping routes and the lightish combat mechanics. Playing Anno 1404 for the first time now made me regret not playing it when it was initially released. It's a super solid blend of a city builder and economic simulation game, a great example of what sequels should be. It takes what 1701 did, further refining and adding to it. So let's talk a bit about the graphics. On the whole, the game is very reminiscent of its prequel. The graphics are similar, the engine is slightly improved. Similarly, the design of the buildings is a visual variation on its prequel, but it adds to the overall graphics palette the Oriental desert islands as well as their specific buildings. Not much left to say here, just that the game still looks great 10 years after its release. Not a lot of changes happen to the core mechanics of the game either. A couple of new things have been added that really make the game that much more realistic, let's say, but overall the game features a bunch of new buildings, resources, items, and interactions between them. You can now trade for special objects that act as buffs for your ships, warehouses, or production facilities. By the by, warehouses still function the same as they did in the prequel. Basically, if a resource is stored in one warehouse anywhere on an island, that resource will be available from any other warehouse situated on the same island, even if they're not connected by any sort of road. The only logical conclusion being that they must have inherited some teleporter technology from some precursor race, or the Dacians. Islands now seem to be a bit larger and can have more resources on them. You can also plant seeds on certain ones and thus create an island with the plant resources you need most. The goods themselves are modified from the prequel so as to be in tune with the theme of the time period. Also, the fact that some of them can only be grown on desert islands and require you to develop a parallel society in order to do so is a very welcome addition to the gameplay, since it adds another layer of challenge to the game without actually making it more complicated. You'd think it's the same thing as simply having a larger kingdom, but in practice it's quite a different sort of experience. The challenges of growing things on desert islands are different, the costs of buildings likewise, and this means that you have to put in some extra focus on your ship routes because those critically needed resources can only come from that type of island. Which granted you had to do in 1701 as well, but here it requires a bit more tinkering with the routes and the timings, since there is really no way to advance the Occidental culture without a constant influx of resources from the Orient. On a personal note, one funny effect of the game is that it made me want to eat dates, but oddly enough the game's limited collector's edition comes with almond seeds, and almonds are in the game as a resource. I would have just expected it to come with date seeds, since these are the first type of food that your desert nomads will require. The other realistic sort of addition to the gameplay is the fact that in Anno 1404 your population is bound by class ratios. This means that you will need a certain number of peasants in order to support a smaller than that number of citizens, which in turn will need to support an even smaller number of patricians and then nobles. While back in 1701 you could have a town or city made up only of patricians, which from a realistic standpoint really cannot function on any sort of level. Just imagine a town where only accountants live. In fact, this feature makes it much easier to plan your residential areas as separate from production areas and whatnot, since you know that only a relatively small portion of an inhabited area can reach the highest level of development. With so much talk about patricians and extra focus on trading routes, this game reminded me of the Patrician series. The current GOG version of the game comes packaged with its expansion as well, Venice, which adds in a ton more quests to the game. These spring up considerably more often and are way more diverse than they were in 1701. One other extra thing that was added to the game, although mind you this isn't a gameplay feature per se, are the in-game achievements. These basically have to do with you managing to hit various milestones of development in increasingly difficult circumstances. The campaign unfortunately is the most lackluster part of the game, I'm sad to say. And I am aware that most people don't play city builders for the campaigns, I certainly don't, but I always check them out to see what they have for me. Plus they're generally a great way to learn the mechanics of a new game. And I really dug the campaign in Anno 1701 The Sunken Dragon, so I was kinda looking forward to this one. In the case of 1404, they also applied the more realistic approach and went with the idea of a crusade. And it's a pretty by the numbers sort of story, unfortunately. It takes some time to get started and there simply wasn't enough in there to keep me interested as much as The Sunken Dragon did. But even so, it's hardly anything close to a deal breaker. Just thought that I should mention it. The main chunk of the game is made up of the scenarios and continuous play options. Scenarios come with already created maps and different sets of objectives. These maps also vary in terms of difficulty according to which scenario you choose. Overall, the scenarios seem to be well balanced while still challenging. There's also an option for player created scenarios, but I'm not sure that functions anymore. Then there's the continuous play option, which is basically where you can play custom games. This is where you have the maximum amount of control over all the difficulty settings of the game, where you control everything from the difficulty and number of AI opponents to the types of disasters that can take place on the map, as well as the size and amount of resources that islands feature and a whole lot more. Continuous play is generally where you'll go when you want the sandbox option of the game. And before someone points it out in the comments, the game does have combat just like its predecessor, but I don't play city builders for the combat, so I don't know how good or bad it is. Sorry viewers, that's just how I roll. So in case you want to play Anno 1800 and can't afford it, like I can't, then I can wholeheartedly suggest you get the considerably cheaper Anno 1404.